Hey everyone, my name's Eric. I'm an engineering manager here at Super in this lovely office. I work on our fintech vertical, so I've tried to sprinkle that into this presentation as much as I possibly can. I wanted to talk today about React Native native modules. And the reason I wanted to talk about that is because really early on, I found them to be very scary because React Native is so nice and beautiful in JavaScript, and React Native modules require like knowing other stuff like Android and iOS and all that jazz. How many people here have used React Native before, like pretty actively? Okay, cool. So like 25% or so. All right, so if we could just jump into the next slide. One of the first things you need to know about React Native, for those who haven't used it, is that it communicates directly with the native phone, so Android or iOS, but you get to build with one platform, ideally, just JavaScript. And most things are handled directly for you. There's this intermediary between like your JavaScript and the actual native application. That's called the bridge, or in the new architecture, which is still quite new and not fully stable, the JavaScript interfaces. In this talk, I'm going to deal mostly with the bridge because that's the mostly used in most legacy applications, and even now, I think if you're starting a new application, it's used in most cases. But effectively, what it's doing is it's sending JavaScript over in JSON, deserializing it over on Android or iOS, doing some work, rendering your components, all that jazz, and sending it back over. With JavaScript interfaces, you get fun new features like turbo modules, which will like let you lazy load native modules instead of loading them all at once. But yeah, like I said, this talk mostly covers the bridge. And one fortunate thing about everything in this talk is that it will be mostly backwards compatible with the JavaScript interface as soon as people decide to switch over. We can hop over to the next one. So what is a native module? Well, one of the benefits of React Native is that you can, if you so desire, go in and write native Android and iOS code and use it in your React Native app. That means you get all of the features that Android offers, all the features that iOS offers, if you really need it, and React Native doesn't support it directly. So you can actually even write native components, so like the actual visuals. You can make something pop up, very beautiful, very heavily optimized for Android or iOS, using some kind of native features, or you can just interface directly with like some hardware level feature that doesn't require visualizations. Typically, it's not part of the normal development cycle. In general, if there's something you want to do, you should really try do it in React Native first instead of going over to a native module. Lots of reasons for this. Now you need to know Android. Now you need to know iOS, and you're writing code for multiple platforms, or you're writing code for 2 platforms, and you're writing the code 3 times because you're writing it in JavaScript, Android, and iOS in a lot of cases. But the open source community is amazing for React and React Native, as I'm sure you all know, which means lots of people have already written these interfaces for us. So if you really need it, go find the package there. They've probably written it already, but there's lots of cases where they haven't. So when should you use this? If you need a really deep optimization. If you've picked all the low-hanging fruit for optimizations in your app, and you're looking to go even deeper and make things really ultra smooth and perfect, that might be a good place to start. Interacting with native functionality, usually check open source first, like I mentioned. But Google Pay, Apple Pay, something like that we just recently implemented in our fintech vertical, would be a great place to use native modules because there is not really an open source application of this, and they're very quite specific to your backend technologies as well. And in some cases, you need more control than what React Native directly gives you over native features. For example, I was building a navigation app for pedestrians at one point in my career, and there isn't really any good open source package for handling background location, which is obviously quite important for navigating as a pedestrian. You don't have your phone open in front of you 100% of the time if you're getting directions in your ear. So we had to go in and build out iOS, Android for that specific module, send it back to the React Native side, and we handled it there. But there really should be a strong use case for this, because you need someone to know Android, you need someone to know iOS, and then you need them to know like those individual modules, and then you need that person to hopefully stick around for a good amount of time, so that they know how it works. And in addition, like now you're building for 2 platforms. React Native supports more than that now, but in general, 2 platforms, and you're writing three sets of code for it. So, okay, I want to just jump in to getting started. I've done this presentation in Java because it would basically take twice as long as if I did it for both Java and iOS. iOS is very similar. I'll talk about it at the end a little bit. I've also gone with Java instead of Kotlin. Kotlin's great. You can do all of this in Kotlin. It's all the same. But if you bill by the hour, I guess you can do it in Java. So first off, you want to create your module class. In general, you can just do it right in your package that is created in Android for you. And this one is called Awesome Project. So I've gone ahead and created a Google Pay module. And that extends the React context-based Java module. I think technically it just needs to extend the base Java module, but you get some additional like lifecycle components if you extend the React context one. And you don't actually need to do a lot there to get started, just super context. And then you need to give it an identifier so that JavaScript knows what your module is called. And that's basically how it's identified in your JavaScript code. So I've called it creatively the Google Pay module. And we can go to the next one. So from there, you're pretty much set from the Android side for now. You can actually go ahead and write your native code. In this case, we're not doing a component. It's a little bit more complex to like build out a visual component. But it's once you know this, like it's just an added layer of complexity that I think is very manageable. So in this case, you would do a bunch of stuff that adds a card to your Google Wallet. And I've conveniently written a helper method here that just logs to the console. So if for whatever reason, in this case, your app doesn't work on the very first go, you'll probably want to use some kind of debugger. Varies for Java and for Android and iOS. But you can use the logcat, which is built right into Android Studio, or you can go to the terminal and type it in and go through the Android debug bridge. It's really quite straightforward once you get it all set up, and filter for your app, and you should be able to see all of your logs there. Okay, so let's say you've written your module, it's working flawlessly, first try, and you now need to export that so that React Native knows what the heck it is. So it's fairly simple. For Android, there's like a bit more code to write. You create this basically package for your module. In this case, all we're doing is creating an array list of modules, and we're adding our module to that list, and then we're returning the list of modules. So that part's fairly straightforward. And then, because it's Android, there's like an extra step where you have to go in and get the packages, where add that to the list of packages, and then return the packages. So it's like a wrapper within a wrapper of your module. But once you've done that, you've effectively exported it. Unless there's one more step, you can go ahead and change this slide. No, that was the last step. So now you can go into your React Native code, and all you have to do is import native modules from React Native. Very straightforward. And then that gets pulled out right there with the Google Pay module from your native modules, and you can go ahead and call it directly on the press of a button. And in theory, that would add your card to the Google Wallet, or just log something in the console, depending on how deep you went with your implementation. And that is how you would create a native module in Android. And we can jump over to the next one. So to summarize, create your module class, write your native code, interact with whatever the heck you want, export your module, import your module, call it. It's fairly straightforward. It's pretty easy to follow these steps. The hardest part is probably writing your native code, but depends on what you want to do. Could be very easy. All right, go ahead. So for iOS, it's fairly similar. There's less wrapping packages within packages and modules within modules. So there's a bit less code, but structurally it's quite similar. And it's conveniently accessed exactly the same way in React Native. So you'll just go like Apple Pay module equals native modules and be able to call it right there. Or if you write it really nicely, you can just say like pay module, name it the same thing, and you're golden. If you want something platform specific, which is quite possible, like lots of Apple features that don't exist on Android and vice versa, you can just easily check the platform in React Native and call whatever you'd like there. So we've done that in the past, and it's particularly important for like background location stuff where the functionality is quite different for both platforms. Yeah, that is it for me. Thanks for listening. I hope this was helpful, and yeah, I can take any questions.
So for someone who's never written like React Native, would you say we have to know like Java to be able to write modules?
So you've never written React Native before?
No.
Okay, so yeah, I wouldn't, like if you're just learning React Native, I wouldn't touch any native module stuff unless there's something very, very specific you want to do. Like with React Native, you just need to jump in with JavaScript. You can do something like with Expo, make it fairly straightforward. It'll run nicely. And if you want to get really deep, then you can start learning like Java. But you don't necessarily need to know any Android or iOS to write React Native. To be clear, it is quite helpful to know this, especially when debugging. When you try and get something working and like Android's failing for some reason and iOS isn't. And it's helpful to be able to go into that file structure and change some things around, but not strictly necessary. And ChatGPT's your friend probably. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
What are like the trade-offs, cons versus pros of like using something like Kotlin over Java?
Oh wow. I think that's very opinionated and like up to personal preference. I haven't really used Kotlin a lot. It looks really nice. It's I think faster to write. Generally it's less verbose, but I think ultimately it compiles to something quite similar. Yeah, I think you had your hand up. Yep. No one behind you. Yep.
So these native modules, they're not only for iOS and Android, right? Like if I'm using React Native Web, are there web-specific native modules if I want to do something like really browser-specific?
So I'm not sure about web, if there are for web. I haven't dug too deep into that. I would imagine so. I imagine the architecture is the same. I know that they just released like Mac OS and Windows. And for that, you can go ahead and write native modules for Windows and Mac OS in React Native. I was just looking at documentation for that. It exists. Yeah.
You work at Super, right?
Sorry?
You work at Super.
Yeah.
So does your guys have a platform built with React Native?
No, we have a React Native app. It's built with that, but we have lots of other verticals that are not strictly React Native. Yeah.
And so obviously, I guess as your products get more complex, you need to narrow down and build for iOS, build for Android. So like, why do you have the React Native for a certain thing, not very specific?
Oh, I think for like startup companies, it's really important to iterate really fast. And React Native allows for that really quickly. So if we were writing like Android and iOS, obviously if you need to make a change or run an experiment or try something out, now you have to write it for two platforms. But that doesn't really make sense when you're in this startup world and want to speed things up really and iterate really quickly. So React Native is really helpful for that until you get to some outrageous critical mass that would require you to go really deep on writing both native. And the nice thing about React Native is like you can technically make as many things as you want very native. So if you want to dive in and make this one page fully native, you can do that and optimize it page by page.
Yeah. I suppose that with modules, like if you're still kind of getting your hands dirty in terms of building like specifically for native devices, I guess it's kind of like when you hit a point where like, okay, let's just switch and go full native. And I suppose one day React Native will get to a point where you don't need to get your hands dirty with modules in an ideal world.
Yeah, I think Airbnb recently switched over from doing React Native to just building out both platforms separately. I think it was Airbnb. They just got to a point where they found they were writing 3 code bases for 2 platforms because they were writing so many native modules. Yeah. Good.
This might be a little bit outside of purview, but like in terms of having to write like 3 different code bases for, or even more for different, mobile web platforms, is there a case you would make in favor of
I'm not sure.
Sorry.
No, yeah.
Outside of purview.
I think if you're writing for like web, you should very much do responsive. But if you're writing, if you're trying to make a native app, like
Or what's the case for the native app over something like just making a single code base for all of them?
oh, I see. Well, there's a lot of performance you get from writing purely native apps over like doing a web app. Lots of performance benefits. You get to interface directly with the hardware if needed. So there's lots of features that don't work for a web app. For example, like we aren't able to add a card to Google Pay or Apple Pay through a web app. We have to basically direct them to use the web app in order to do that. So there's lots of feature cases on top of just performance cases and having a good user experience. Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, everyone.